I never thought I'd be standing in my backyard at 51, watching a man trim my hedges while my heart did somersaults like a teenager's. But there I was, clutching my coffee mug so tight I thought it might crack, staring at David as he worked, his way through the overgrown maze that had become my back fence. The question that had been burning in my chest for weeks finally escaped before I could stop it. Would you marry me if I wasn't 51? Be honest. The hedge trimmer went silent. David's shoulders froze mid-clip, and for a moment I thought maybe the autumn wind had carried my words away. Maybe I could pretend I'd asked about the weather, or whether he wanted more coffee. But when he turned around, those kind brown eyes of his told me he'd heard every syllable. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Linda Morrison, and 6 months ago I would have laughed if someone told me I'd be asking such a ridiculous question to a man I barely knew. I'm a retired 5th grade teacher from Riverside, Ohio, the kind of woman who plans her grocery, lists a week in advance, and irons her sheets on Sundays. My life had been predictable, organized, and frankly a little lonely since my divorce 6 years ago. The whole thing started back in April when I finally admitted that my backyard had become a jungle. The hedge maze that my ex-husband Roger had planted during one of his ambitious weekend phases had grown wild and unruly, just like our marriage had. I'd been putting off dealing with it, partly because it reminded me of happier times, and partly because I had no idea where to begin. When my sister Carol suggested I hire someone, I balked at the idea of letting a stranger into my carefully controlled world. That's when Betty Kowalski, my 77-year-old neighbor who sees everything from her front porch kingdom, mentioned David Chen. "He's good with his hands," she'd said with a knowing wink that made me blush. "Lost his wife a few years back. Runs an honest business. You should call him." I'd seen David around town, of course. Riverside isn't exactly Manhattan. He was the quiet guy who drove the weathered blue pickup truck, always nodding politely when we'd pass each other at Miller's hardware store or the post office. I knew he'd done work for the Hendersons down the street, and their yard always looked immaculate. What I didn't know was that hiring him would turn my orderly world completely upside down. The first time he knocked on my door, I almost didn't answer. I was wearing my oldest jeans with paint stains from when I'd attempted to redo my bathroom last summer, and my hair was pulled back in what could generously be called a ponytail, but more accurately resembled a bird's nest. But something about his patient knock, not too insistent but not hesitant either, made me open the door. "Mrs. Morrison? I'm David Chen. Betty Kowalski said you might need some help with your landscaping." He was shorter than I'd imagined, maybe 5'8" to my 5'6", with graying hair at his temples and hands that looked like they'd seen honest work. There was something immediately comforting about him, like a favorite sweater that fits just right. When he smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkled in a way that suggested he laughed often, even though I'd heard through the town grapevine that he'd been through more than his share of heartache. "Just Linda, please," I'd said, stepping aside to let him through. "And yes, I definitely need help. Fair warning, though, it's pretty bad back there." When he saw the backyard, he didn't laugh or shake his head like I'd expected. Instead, he walked the perimeter slowly, occasionally touching a branch or testing the soil with his boot. I found myself watching the way he moved, deliberate but not rushed, like he was having a conversation with the plants that I couldn't hear. "This is beautiful work," he said finally, surprising me. Someone put a lot of thought into the original design. It just needs some attention. The way he said attention made something flutter in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Roger had never paid attention to anything I cared about, not really. He'd planted the hedge maze during one of his brief enthusiastic phases, then lost interest when it required actual maintenance. But David saw something worth preserving. We agreed he'd come twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays, to work on bringing the yard back to life. What I didn't expect was how much I'd look forward to those days. I started timing my morning routine so I'd be having coffee on the back porch when he arrived. At first, I told myself it was just being a good neighbor, making sure he had everything he needed. But if I'm being honest, something about watching him work was deeply satisfying. David had this way of approaching each plant like it was a puzzle to solve rather than a problem to eliminate. He'd step back, consider the overall shape, then make careful, precise cuts. Sometimes he'd hum while he worked, old songs I half remembered from the radio in my childhood. Other times he'd mutter to himself, carrying on quiet conversations with particularly stubborn branches. After the third week, I started bringing him coffee without being asked. He'd always thank me with that genuine smile and take a short break to chat about the weather, the progress of the work, or some bit of town gossip Betty had shared with both of us independently. I learned that he'd moved to Riverside 12 years ago when his wife Sarah got a job at the regional hospital. They'd planned to start a family, fix up the old Victorian house they'd bought, maybe get a dog. Cancer had derailed all those plans 3 years into their Riverside adventure. "She would have loved this," he said one Friday in May, gesturing toward a section of hedge he'd shaped into gentle curves. Sarah had big dreams for gardens, never got the chance to see most of them through. The sadness in his voice was quiet, worn smooth by time, but still present. I recognized it because I carried my own version. Not grief for a person, but grief for the life I'd thought I was building. The marriage that had slowly crumbled under the weight of indifference and routine. The children Roger and I had talked about, but never quite gotten around to having. The dreams that had been put off until someday, and someday had never come. As spring turned to summer, our conversations grew longer. He'd finish a section of work, and I'd find reasons to keep him talking. I learned that he'd been an engineer before Sarah's illness made him reevaluate everything. Now he found more satisfaction in working with his hands, seeing immediate results from his efforts. I told him about my early retirement, how budget cuts had pushed me out of teaching just when I was hitting my stride, and how I was still figuring out what came next. "It's funny," I said one particularly warm afternoon in July. "I spent 30 years helping kids figure out who they wanted to become, and now I have no idea who I am." He paused in his weeding, looking up at me with those thoughtful eyes. "Maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it means you get to choose." The idea that I could choose at 51 who to become was both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd spent so many years being Roger's wife, then Roger's ex-wife, then the teacher who got laid off, that I'd forgotten I could simply be Linda. Just Linda, with her own wants and dreams and possibilities. By August, David had transformed my backyard into something magical. The hedge maze now had clear paths and interesting alcoves. He'd added flower beds that bloomed in succession, ensuring color from spring through fall. But more than that, he'd transformed something in me. I found myself buying new clothes, not because I needed them, but because I wanted to. I started accepting invitations I would have declined before. I even signed up for the pottery class at the community center, something I'd been thinking about for years. It was at pottery class, actually, where I first admitted to myself that what I felt for David had grown beyond gratitude for good landscaping. We were working on creating bowls, and the instructor was talking about how clay responds to gentle, consistent pressure rather than force. As my hands shaped the spinning clay, I thought about how David had approached my wild garden with that same patient persistence, how he'd seen beauty in the chaos and worked carefully to reveal it without destroying what was already there. That's when I realized he'd been doing the same thing with me. September brought the kind of crisp mornings that made me want to wrap myself in oversized sweaters and drink endless cups of tea. It also brought my son Marcus home for what he called a creative sabbatical. But what I suspected was a polite way of saying his art career in Columbus had hit a wall. At 28, Marcus had inherited his father's stubborn streak and my tendency to overthink everything. a combination that often left him paralyzed by his own expectations. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with 2 duffel bags, a easel that had seen better days, and the kind of defeated expression that made my maternal instincts kick into overdrive. I was in the kitchen making my morning coffee when I heard his car pull into the driveway, and my heart did that familiar dance between joy at seeing him and worry about what had brought him home. "Hey, Mom," he said, giving me a hug that lasted longer than usual. "Hope you don't mind an unexpected house guest for a while." "You know you're always welcome here," I replied, studying his face for clues. The dark circles under his eyes and the way his shoulders seemed to carry invisible weight told me more than his words ever would. "What's going on, sweetheart?" Marcus had always been my sensitive child, the one who felt everything deeply and expressed it through colors and shapes that most people didn't understand. His father, Roger, had never quite known what to do with a son who preferred paintbrushes to power tools, and I sometimes wondered if that early lack of support had made Marcus doubt himself more than he should. "I just need some time to figure things out," he said, settling into the kitchen chair that had been his favorite spot since childhood. "The gallery scene in Columbus is brutal, and I'm starting to question whether I'm actually any good at this or if I've been deluding myself. For years." Before I could respond with the kind of encouraging mother speech that I knew he didn't want to hear, David appeared at the back door. It was his regular Friday morning, and he always knocked on the kitchen door rather than going straight to work. The routine had become so natural that I'd stopped thinking about it, but seeing him through Marcus's eyes suddenly made me acutely aware of how much my life had changed. "Morning, Linda," David said, then noticed Marcus and extended his hand. "You must be Marcus. I'm David Chen. Your mom's told me a lot about your artwork." I watched nervously as the 2 most important men in my current life sized each other up. Marcus had always been protective of me, especially after the divorce, and I wasn't sure how he'd react to finding a man so clearly comfortable in what had been our space. "Nice to meet you," Marcus said, his handshake firm but his expression guarded. "Mom mentioned she was having some landscaping done." David's smile didn't waver, but I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he understood exactly what was happening. "Your mother has great vision for the garden. I'm just helping her bring it to life." The polite exchange that followed was filled with the kind of subtext that made me want to hide under the kitchen table. Marcus asking pointed questions about timelines and David answering with the patience of someone who'd clearly dealt with protective family members before. I found myself jumping in with unnecessary explanations, which only made everything more awkward. After David headed outside to work, Marcus turned to me with the kind of direct stare that reminded me uncomfortably of his father. "So, how long has this been going on?" "What do you mean this?" I asked, though we both knew exactly what he meant. "Mom, the man knows where you keep your coffee mugs, and he knocked on the door like he belongs here. Don't insult my intelligence." I sat down across from him, suddenly feeling like I was the child being called out for breaking curfew. "We're friends, Marcus. He's been working on the garden since spring, and we've gotten to know each other. That's all." The look he gave me suggested he wasn't buying it, but thankfully he didn't push. Instead, he glanced out the window where David was methodically working through a section of overgrown shrubs. "He seems nice enough, I guess. Just be careful, okay? You went through enough with Dad." His concern touched me, but it also sparked a flicker of irritation. I was 51 years old, perfectly capable of making my own decisions about relationships. The fact that I'd been questioning those same decisions for weeks didn't make his protective interference any less frustrating. The next few days established an uneasy routine. Marcus set up his easel in the spare bedroom and threw himself into painting with the kind of manic energy that usually preceded either a breakthrough or a breakdown. I tried to give him space while also keeping an eye on him, a delicate balance that left me feeling stretched thin. Meanwhile, David continued. His regular schedule, but the easy comfort we'd developed over the summer felt strained with Marcus's watchful presence. It all came to a head the following Tuesday when my sister Carol decided to drop by unannounced. Carol had always been the practical one in our family, the nurse who dealt with life's messiness without flinching. She was also the one who'd supported me through my divorce and never quite trusted my judgment about men since. I was upstairs helping Marcus hang some of his paintings when I heard voices in the backyard. Looking out the window, I saw Carol cornering David near the tool shed, her arms crossed in what I recognized as her interrogation stance. My stomach dropped. "Oh no," I muttered, rushing downstairs and outside. "And exactly what are your intentions?" "With my sister?" Carol was saying as I approached, her voice carrying the authority she'd perfected during 25 years of dealing with difficult patients. David, to his credit, looked more amused than intimidated. "I intend to finish trimming her hedges and maybe help her plant some bulbs for spring color." "You know that's not what I mean," Carol shot back. "Carol," I interrupted, mortified. "What are you doing?" "Someone needs to ask the hard questions, Linda. You're not exactly known for your great judgment when it comes to men." The reference to Roger hung in the air like smoke from a fire nobody wanted to acknowledge. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment, not just for myself but for David, who was witnessing my family's dysfunction firsthand. "I think I'll give you ladies some privacy," David said diplomatically, gathering his tools. "Linda, I'll finish up tomorrow if that works for you." After he left, I turned on Carol with more anger than I'd felt in years. "How dare you ambush him like that? And how dare you suggest I can't make my own decisions?" "Because your track record speaks for itself," she replied, not backing down. "Roger seemed nice too, remember? Charming, attentive, said all the right things. Look how that turned out." The comparison stung because it wasn't entirely unfair. Roger had been charming in the beginning, sweeping me off my feet with grand gestures and passionate declarations. It had taken years for me to realize that his charm was performative, designed to get what he wanted rather than express what he felt. Marcus appeared in the doorway, having apparently heard enough of the argument to get the gist. "What's going on out here?" "Your aunt thinks I'm making a mistake getting involved with David," I said, crossing my arms. "Are you? Involved with him, I mean?" Marcus asked. The question hung there, demanding an honest answer I wasn't sure I was ready to give. Was I involved with David? We hadn't kissed, hadn't even held hands. Our relationship existed in the safe space of friendly conversation and shared appreciation for growing things. But the way my heart raced when I heard his truck in the driveway, the way I found myself thinking about him during the quiet hours of the evening, the way I'd started planning my days around his visits suggested that, yes, I was very much involved, whether I'd admitted it to myself or not. "I don't know," I said finally. "Maybe. Does it matter?" "It matters if you get hurt again," Carol said, her voice softer now. "You're just starting to seem like yourself again, Linda. I don't want to see you lose that." That evening, after Carol had left and Marcus had retreated to his room to paint, I sat on my back porch looking at the garden David had helped me create. The late September air carried the scent of the last roses and the earthy smell of leaves beginning to turn. In the fading light, I could see the careful structure he'd imposed on the chaos, the way he'd preserved the original vision while making it sustainable and beautiful. I thought about Roger, who had planted the hedge maze with grand dreams, but no follow-through. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to maintain something that was designed poorly from the start. And I thought about David, who approached everything with patience and skill, who saw potential rather than problems, who made me feel capable rather than needy. The truth was, I was scared. Scared of making another mistake. Scared of being vulnerable. Scared of disrupting the careful peace I'd built for myself. but I was also tired of letting fear make my decisions. At 51, how much time did I have left to play it safe? When my phone buzzed with a text message, I almost didn't check, but when I saw David's name on the screen, my pulse quickened. Hope your family situation is okay. See you Friday as usual? I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. 3 simple sentences that somehow contained multitudes. He wasn't running away from the drama. He wasn't making assumptions or demands. He was simply asking if he should continue showing up, the same way he had every Tuesday and Friday for months. Yes, I typed back. And David? Thank you for being patient with us. His response came quickly. Good people are worth waiting for. As I sat there in the gathering darkness, I realized that my question about marrying him if I wasn't 51 had been the wrong question entirely. The right question was whether I was brave enough to find out what might happen if I stopped, letting my age, my past, and my fear decide my future. October arrived with a vengeance, bringing the kind of cold snap that made everyone in Riverside scramble to find their winter coats buried in closets. The sudden chill seemed to mirror the tension that had settled over my house like frost on morning grass. Marcus had been painting furiously for 2 weeks, emerging from his makeshift studio only for meals and the occasional monosyllabic conversation. David continued his regular visits, but something had shifted between us since Carol's interrogation, a careful politeness that made me miss our easy summer conversations. I was wrestling with a particularly stubborn storm window when Betty Kowalski appeared at my front gate, moving with the determined stride of someone carrying important news. At 77, Betty had elevated neighborhood intelligence gathering to an art form, and the gleam in her eyes suggested she had information that couldn't wait for our usual Friday morning coffee. "Linda, dear, do you have a moment?" she called, already making her way up the front walk without waiting for an answer. "Of course, Betty. What's going on?" I set down the window and wiped my hands on my jeans, bracing myself for whatever bombshell she was about to drop. "Well, I hate to be the bearer of difficult news, but I thought you should know. David's ex-wife is back in town." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I had no right to feel that way. David had never mentioned an ex-wife, and we'd certainly never discussed the exclusivity of whatever was happening between us. Still, the news sent my stomach plummeting toward my shoes. "Ex-wife?" I managed to ask, trying to keep my voice steady. Betty settled onto my front porch swing as if preparing for a long story. "Jennifer Chen. Well, Jennifer Walsh now, I suppose. They were married for about 3 years, right after he moved to Riverside. Nasty divorce from what I heard. She left town with some real estate developer from Cincinnati, took half of everything David had built here. I felt the careful equilibrium I'd been maintaining start to wobble. When did she come back? Yesterday morning. Saw her at Miller's Hardware, bold as brass, asking Bill Miller about David's business. Apparently, she's got some legal papers she needs him to sign, something about finalizing property they still own together. Betty's eyes sparkled with the satisfaction of someone delivering truly shocking news. Thought you should know, given how close you two have become. After Betty left, I found myself pacing the house like a caged animal. The rational part of my brain knew I was overreacting. So what if David had an ex-wife? So what if she was back in town? I had an ex-husband myself, and Roger occasionally surfaced to deal with paperwork or ask favors. It didn't mean anything significant. But the irrational part of my brain, the part that had been burned by Roger's gradual withdrawal and ultimate betrayal, was spinning worst-case scenarios faster than I could dismiss them. What if David wasn't as over his marriage as I'd assumed? What if seeing Jennifer again made him realize he'd made a mistake? What if whatever was developing between us was just a rebound that would evaporate the moment his real life reasserted itself? I was still wrestling with these thoughts when Marcus emerged from his room, paint-stained and looking like he hadn't slept in days. One glance at my face told him something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, settling into the kitchen chair that had become his unofficial therapy seat. I told him about Betty's news, trying to keep my voice neutral, but probably failing spectacularly. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was unusual for him and somehow made me more nervous. "Mom," he said finally, "can I ask you something? And will you give me an honest answer?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was ready for whatever question had that serious tone in his voice. "Do you love him?" The question hung in the air between us, simple and complex at the same time. Love seemed like such a big word for what David and I had shared. We'd talked about gardens and weather and the small details of daily life. We'd never discussed feelings or made promises or even acknowledged that what was happening between us was anything more than friendship. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I care about him. I look forward to seeing him. I feel more like myself when he's around than I have in years." "Is that love?" Marcus studied me with the intensity he usually reserved for his paintings. "It sounds like the beginning of love, which means you have a right to know where you stand." That afternoon, I decided to take a walk downtown, ostensibly to pick up groceries, but really to see if I could gather more information about Jennifer's return. Riverside's main street was only 4 blocks long, and news traveled faster than gossip in a beauty salon. If Jennifer was indeed back and making waves, someone would know the details. I found more than I bargained for at the Riverside diner. Jennifer was sitting in a corner booth, and even from across the restaurant, I could see why David had married her. She was striking in that effortless way some women managed, with auburn, hair that caught the light and the kind of confident posture that suggested she was comfortable being the center of attention. What surprised me was that she wasn't alone. David sat across from her, his back to me, his shoulders tense in a way I'd never seen before. They appeared to be having an intense conversation, their heads bent together over what looked like official documents spread across the table. I stood frozen in the doorway, torn between the urge to march over and demand explanations and the equally strong desire to run home and pretend I'd never seen them together. The decision was made for me when Jennifer looked up and caught my eye. For a moment, we stared at each other across the restaurant, 2 women whose lives had intersected through one man, neither quite sure how to navigate the situation. Jennifer said something to David, who turned around to see what had caught her attention. When his eyes met mine, I saw surprise, concern, and something that might have been guilt. He started to stand, but I was already backing toward the door, mumbling something to the hostess about forgetting my purse. I made it halfway home before the tears started. Not the dramatic sobbing of a teenager's broken heart, but the quiet, frustrated tears of a woman who thought she'd learned better than to put herself in vulnerable positions. I'd done it again, invested emotionally in someone whose full story I didn't know, someone who clearly had unfinished business that didn't include me. By the time I reached my front porch, I'd worked myself into a state of righteous indignation. How dare David let me develop feelings for him when he was still legally entangled with his ex-wife? How dare he let me imagine possibilities when he clearly had his own complications to sort out? I was still fuming when his truck pulled into my driveway an hour later. Through the front window, I watched him sit in the cab for a long moment, probably gathering courage for whatever conversation he'd come to have. When he finally knocked on the door, I considered not answering, but that felt childish even for my current mood. "Linda," he said when I opened the door, "I think we need to talk." "I think you're right," I replied, stepping aside to let him in but not moving toward the kitchen where we usually had our conversations. The living room felt more formal, more appropriate for whatever this was about to become. David sat on the edge of the sofa, his hands clasped between his knees. "I saw you at the diner. I should have called first, explained what was happening." "You don't owe me explanations," I said, though we both knew that wasn't entirely true. "We're not. I mean, we haven't. Linda." His voice was gentle but firm. "Look at me. I met his eyes reluctantly, steeling myself for whatever revelation was coming. Jennifer and I were married for 3 years, from 2015 to 2018. She left me for another man and moved to Cincinnati. We've been legally divorced for 6 years, but there was some property we bought together that we never properly divided. She's back to finalize those details so she can remarry. The relief that flooded through me was embarrassing in its intensity, but it was quickly followed by shame at my assumptions and insecurity. "I'm sorry," I said. "I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. It's just that Betty mentioned she was back and then seeing you together made you think I was hiding something important from you," he finished. "And you're right to think that because I was." My heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" David took a deep breath, like a man preparing to jump off a cliff. "I was hiding the fact that I'm falling in love with you, and seeing Jennifer again made me realize how different what I feel for you is from anything I felt for her. Jennifer and I had passion, but we never had partnership. We never had the easy comfort that you and I have found. And I was scared that if you knew about her, you'd think I was still carrying baggage from that relationship." The words hung between us, honest and vulnerable and completely unexpected. I felt my carefully constructed walls crumbling, leaving me exposed but somehow stronger. "David," I said softly, "I asked you if you'd marry me if I wasn't 51, because I was scared you'd think I was too old, too set in my ways, too damaged from my divorce to be worth the risk. We've both been so busy protecting ourselves that we've been missing what's right in front of us." He stood up then, crossing the small distance between us and taking my hands in his. "What if we stopped being scared? What if we just tried being honest about what we want?" "What do you want?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I want to keep showing up here twice a week, not just to work in your garden, but because being near you makes everything better. I want to know what you're thinking when you get that faraway look while you're drinking your morning coffee. I want to be the person you call when something good happens or when something goes wrong. I want to stop pretending this is just about landscaping." The honesty in his voice broke something open in my chest, some tight knot of fear I'd been carrying. For so long I'd forgotten it was there. "I want all of that too," I admitted, "and I want to stop letting other people's opinions and my own insecurities decide what I'm allowed to feel." When he kissed me, it was nothing like the passionate, overwhelming kisses I remembered from my youth. It was gentle and certain, the kiss of two people who had learned that real intimacy wasn't about fireworks, but about choosing each other, consistently and completely, in all the small moments that made up a life. The morning after David, and I finally stopped dancing around our feelings, I woke up with the kind of nervous energy that comes from crossing a line you can't uncross. Everything felt different, yet exactly the same. The autumn light streaming through my bedroom windows looked softer somehow, and even the sound of Mrs. Patterson's dog barking next door seemed less annoying. I caught myself humming while making coffee, something I hadn't done since before my divorce. David had left the evening before with a promise to return Saturday morning, not for work, but for what he'd called a proper date, complete with lunch and a drive to see the fall foliage in the hills outside Riverside. The idea of an actual date at 51 felt both thrilling and terrifying, like learning to ride a bicycle all over again, but with much higher stakes. I was still savoring my second cup of coffee when Marcus shuffled into the kitchen, his hair sticking up in directions that defied gravity, and his eyes squinting against the morning light. He'd been painting until 3 a.m. again, the sounds of his creative process filtering through the walls like a storm that couldn't quite break. "You look different," he said, settling into his usual chair and eyeing me suspiciously. Did something happen with the landscaper? The way he said landscaper made it clear he still hadn't quite accepted David as anything more than hired help, despite the obvious shift in dynamics around the house. "His name is David, and yes, something happened," I said, deciding that honesty was probably the best policy. We talked, really talked, and we're going to try dating, officially. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring into the coffee mug I'd placed in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that reminded me he was dealing with his own complicated feelings about change and new beginnings. Are you sure about this, Mom? I mean, really sure? Because watching you go through the divorce with Dad was hard enough. I don't think I could handle seeing you get hurt like that again. The protective concern in his voice touched something deep in my chest. Marcus had been 19 when Roger and I separated, old enough to understand what was happening, but young enough to feel responsible for somehow fixing it. I'd tried to shield him from the worst of the fighting and the bitter aftermath, but children see more than parents think they do. I can't promise I won't get hurt, I said gently. Love always comes with that risk, but I can promise that I'm going into this with my eyes open. David isn't your father, and I'm not the same woman I was then. Before Marcus could respond, we heard the unmistakable sound of Carol's car pulling into the driveway. My sister had a way of appearing at the most inconvenient moments, as if she had some kind of radar for family drama. Through the kitchen window, I watched her stride up the front walk with the determined gait of someone on a mission. Brace yourself, I murmured to Marcus, who groaned and buried his face in his hands. Carol knocked once and then let herself in, a privilege she'd claimed since childhood and never relinquished. She found us in the kitchen, took one look at my face, and crossed her arms in that familiar stance that meant she was preparing for battle. Betty Kowalski called me, she announced without preamble. She said David's ex-wife is back in town, and that you were seen having some kind of public moment at the diner yesterday. Please tell me you're not making a huge mistake. The fact that Betty had called Carol shouldn't have surprised me. Riverside's gossip network was more efficient than the internet, and my sister had somehow positioned herself as the final authority on my romantic decisions, a role I'd never officially granted her. What I'm doing or not doing with David is my business, Carol, I said, trying to keep my voice level. I'm a grown woman, and I don't need your permission to date someone. No, but you apparently need someone to remind you to use common sense, she shot back. This man has an ex-wife who just happened to show up right when things are getting serious between you two. Don't you think that's a little convenient? Marcus looked back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match, clearly torn between defending me and agreeing with Carol's concerns. The kitchen suddenly felt too small for all the emotions swirling around it. Jennifer came back to finalize property issues from their divorce, I explained, though I hated having to justify myself. It has nothing to do with me or with what's happening between David and me. And you know this how? Carol pressed. Because he told you? Linda, you barely know this man. You've been dating him for what, 6 months of yard work conversations? The dismissive way she reduced my relationship with David to yard work conversations sparked something angry and protective in my chest. She was doing what she'd always done, treating me like I was too naive or too emotional to make good decisions about my own life. I know him well enough to trust him, I said, firmly. And I know myself well enough to recognize when something feels right. This feels right, Carol. For the first time in years, something in my life feels genuinely right. The argument might have escalated further if David's truck hadn't pulled into the driveway at that exact moment. Through the window, I could see him checking his watch, probably wondering if he was too early for our planned date. The sight of him sitting there, patient and reliable as always, strengthened my resolve. He's here, I announced, grabbing my jacket from the chair where I'd left it the night before. Marcus, Carol, I love you both, but I'm 51 years old and I'm going on a date. We can continue this conversation later if necessary, but right now, I'm choosing happiness. I made it halfway to the door before Carol's voice stopped me. Linda, wait. Her tone had shifted from confrontational to something softer, more vulnerable. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to control your life. I'm just scared of watching you get hurt again. I turned back to face my sister, seeing past her protective anger to the genuine fear underneath. Carol had been my rock during the divorce, fielding late-night phone calls and helping me navigate the legal paperwork and emotional aftermath. She'd watched me struggle to rebuild my confidence and sense of self, and the idea of me potentially going through that again clearly terrified her. I know you're scared, I said gently. I'm scared too. But I can't let fear make all my decisions anymore. If David breaks my heart, then at least I'll know I was brave enough to let someone try to love me again. Marcus stood up then, crossing the kitchen to give me a hug that felt like forgiveness and blessing combined. Go on your date, Mom, he said. Just promise me you'll be careful. I promise, I said, meaning it. David was still sitting in his truck when I emerged from the house, and I could see him watching the drama unfold through the kitchen window, with an expression of polite concern. When I approached the passenger door, he leaned over to open it for me, a small gesture that somehow felt significant. Everything okay in there? He asked as I buckled my seatbelt. Family, I said by way of explanation. They mean well, but they're having trouble adjusting to the idea that I might be happy. David nodded as if he understood completely. My daughter Hannah is coming to visit next weekend. She's been cautious about the idea of me dating. Again. I think she's worried I'm trying to replace her mother. The mention of his daughter sent a small flutter of nervousness through my stomach. Meeting the children was a significant step in any relationship, but especially when those children were adults with their own complicated feelings about their parents' romantic lives. What did you tell her about me? I asked. I told her you make me laugh, he said simply, and that I haven't felt this hopeful about the future in a very long time. We drove out of Riverside toward the rolling hills that surrounded our small town, the landscape painted in the brilliant oranges and reds of peak autumn. David had packed a picnic lunch, complete with sandwiches wrapped in wax paper and a thermos of coffee that was still warm. We found a spot overlooking the valley, spread a blanket on the ground, and settled in to watch the world show off its seasonal splendor. Can I ask you something? David said as we shared the sandwiches he'd made. What changed your mind about us? Because yesterday morning I got the distinct impression you were ready to run in the opposite direction. I considered the question while watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. I realized I was asking the wrong questions. Instead of wondering whether I was too old or too damaged or too scared, I started wondering what I would regret more. Taking a chance on something that might not work out, or playing it safe and missing something that might be wonderful. And I decided I'd rather risk being hurt than guarantee being lonely. David reached over and took my hand, threading our fingers together in a way that felt both new and familiar. I keep thinking about something you said yesterday, about how you asked if I'd marry you if you weren't 51. The thing is, I wouldn't want you if you weren't 51. I wouldn't want you if you hadn't lived through everything that brought you to this point. The woman you are now, with all your experience and wisdom and careful hope, is exactly who I've been waiting for. As the afternoon sun slanted lower through the trees, painting everything in golden light, I felt something settle into place in my chest. Not the desperate, anxious love I'd known in my youth, but something steadier and more sustainable. The kind of love that could weather ordinary Tuesday mornings and family complications and ex-wives with legal paperwork. So what happens now? I asked. Now we take it one day at a time, David said. We introduce each other to our children and see how that goes. We figure out what it means to blend two lives that have already been fully lived. We probably make some mistakes and learn from them. That sounds terrifyingly reasonable, said, making him laugh. The best things usually are. As we packed up the picnic and prepared to head back to Riverside, I realized that somewhere between trimming hedges and sharing morning coffee, between family drama and honest conversations, I'd stopped being afraid of the answer to my original question. Whether David would marry me if I wasn't 51 no longer mattered, because he seemed perfectly content to love me exactly as I was. 3 months later, I found myself standing in my backyard on a crisp January morning, watching David install the last of the winter bird feeders we'd picked out together at Miller's Hardware. The garden looked completely different under its blanket of snow, but somehow more beautiful in its stark simplicity. The hedge maze that had started this whole journey now provided shelter for cardinals and blue jays, their bright colors vivid against the white landscape. Hannah Chen had arrived for her promised visit in November, and I'd spent weeks beforehand alternating between excitement and sheer terror. David's 26-year-old daughter was a pediatric nurse in Cleveland. With her mother's gentle nature and her father's practical wisdom, I'd worried she might see me as an intruder trying to fill a space that belonged to her mother, but Hannah surprised me with her directness and warmth. "Dad seems lighter since he met you," she'd said during our first conversation over dinner at the Riverside diner. He laughs more. He talks about future plans instead of just getting through each day. I haven't seen that since before Mom got sick. Her blessing hadn't been given lightly, and I treasured it more than any formal approval could have meant. Hannah had spent a long weekend with us, helping David winterize the garden and teaching me her mother's recipe for apple cinnamon bread. Watching father and daughter work together, I'd seen glimpses of the family David had lost and the one he was slowly building again. Marcus had come around more gradually, his artist's sensitivity making him cautious about change. But David's patient interest in his paintings and genuine questions about technique had eventually won him over. The turning point had come when David commissioned Marcus to paint a portrait of the garden in all 4 seasons, treating his art as valuable rather than frivolous. The first painting, showing the hedge maze in its spring awakening, now hung in David's living room, and Marcus beamed every time someone admired it. Carol had taken the longest to accept our relationship, clinging to her protective instincts like armor. But even she had been forced to acknowledge David's consistency and kindness when he'd shown up during her bout with pneumonia in December, bringing homemade soup and offering to shovel her driveway without being asked. The gesture had meant more to her than any grand romantic declaration could have meant to me. "I suppose he's all right," she'd grudgingly admitted after he'd left that day. "Just don't expect me to start planning your wedding or anything." The mention of weddings made me smile now as I watched David adjust the height of a finch feeder. We'd talked about marriage in the abstract, the way couples do when they're testing the waters of forever. But there was no rush, no pressure, to formalize what already felt solid and real. We were both old enough to know that love wasn't about checking boxes or meeting timelines. It was about choosing each other, again and again, in all the small moments that made up a shared life. David had effectively moved in sometime around Christmas, though we'd never made an official announcement about it. His clothes had migrated to my closet gradually. His coffee mug had claimed permanent residence next to mine in the kitchen cabinet, and his truck had worn a permanent path in my driveway. The transition had been so natural that we'd both been surprised when Marcus pointed out that David had been there every morning for 2 weeks straight. "I guess we should probably talk about living arrangements," I'd said that evening as we cleaned up after dinner. "Are you asking me to move in with you?" David had replied with that gentle smile that still made my heart skip. "I'm asking if you want to stop pretending you don't already live here," I'd answered. And that had been that. Now, watching him work in the garden that had brought us together, I marveled at how seamlessly our lives had woven together. David had kept his apartment above Tony's garage, using it as an office for his landscaping business and a retreat when he needed space to think. I'd maintained my independence too, keeping my own routines and friendships while learning to accommodate another person's needs and preferences. The learning curve hadn't always been smooth. We'd had our first real argument in December over something as mundane as thermostat settings, but we'd worked through it with the kind of honest communication that comes from wanting to solve problems, rather than win battles. David preferred the house warmer than I did, so we'd compromised with zone heating and extra blankets. I liked to plan meals a week in advance, while he preferred spontaneous cooking based on whatever looked good at the market. We'd learned to blend structure with flexibility, finding a rhythm that worked for both of us. Betty Kowalski had become our unofficial relationship chronicler, documenting our progress with the enthusiasm of someone watching her favorite soap opera. She'd taken credit for introducing us, conveniently forgetting that she'd also been the one to stir up drama about Jennifer's return. These days, she mostly contented herself with offering unsolicited advice about everything from our landscaping choices to our future family planning. "You should get married in the garden," she'd announced just last week, as if our engagement was a foregone conclusion. June would be perfect, when everything's in bloom. The suggestion hadn't horrified me the way it might have 6 months earlier. The idea of promising forever to David in the space where we'd first learned to trust each other felt fitting, even beautiful. But I wasn't ready to plan a wedding just yet. I was still savoring the simple pleasure of being part of a couple again, of having someone to share daily jokes and minor frustrations with. "The Finches are back," David called from across the yard, interrupting my thoughts. "Same pair from last year, I think." They've been checking out the new feeder all morning. I walked over to join him, slipping my arm through his as we watched the tiny birds dart back and forth, gradually building confidence in their new feeding station. There was something deeply satisfying about providing for wild creatures, about creating a space where life could flourish. "I've been thinking," David said, not taking his eyes off the birds. "About what Betty said last week. About June." My heart gave a small leap, but I kept my voice steady. "Oh? What about June?" "Well, by then the garden will be at its peak. All the work we've put in over the past year will be showing off, and Hannah will be finished with her nursing certification program so she could take time off." He paused, finally looking at me with an expression that was both nervous and hopeful. "What would you think about making it official then? In front of our families in the place where it all started?" The question hung in the cold air between us, more serious than my original hedge trimming inquiry, but somehow less fraught. We'd spent months learning each other's rhythms, navigating family dynamics, and building something steady and real. Marriage wouldn't change the fundamental nature of what we'd created, but it would announce to the world our intention to keep choosing each other, no matter what challenges came our way. "Are you asking me to marry you?" I said, echoing his words from months earlier. "I'm asking if you'd want to marry me, even though I'm 55 and set in my ways and probably snore." "Louder than you'd prefer," he replied with a grin. "I'm asking if you'd want to marry me, even though I'm 51 and stubborn and have a family that still thinks they get to vote on my life choices," I countered. "Yes," he said simply. "To all of it. Every stubborn, complicated, beautiful bit of it." "Then yes," I said, rising up on my toes to kiss him properly. "Let's get married in June when everything's in bloom." As we stood there in my backyard, planning our future while winter birds flitted around us, I thought about the circuitous path that had led us here. If someone had told me a year ago that I'd be engaged to my landscaper by the following winter, I would have laughed until I cried. But life had taught me that the best things often came disguised as ordinary moments, as simple questions about hedge trimming that revealed deeper truths about love and courage and the willingness to start over. The garden around us held the promise of spring buried beneath the snow, just as our relationship had held the promise of love buried beneath months of careful friendship. Come June, when the hedge maze was green and full and the flower beds were bursting with color, we'd stand in this same spot and promise each other forever. But really, we'd been making that promise all along, one shared coffee at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one day at a time. Sometimes the answer to "would you marry me" isn't about age or timing or perfect circumstances. Sometimes it's simply about finding someone who sees the beauty in your overgrown places and is willing to help you tend them with patience and care. Sometimes love arrives with garden tools and a gentle smile, ready to help you bloom exactly where you're planted. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.